We have a very important Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius to talk about this week. Today, as I'm speaking, it's November 25th, and depending on your location, Mercury will be stationing retrograde in Sagittarius on November 25th or November 26th. Now, if it sounds like most of the astrology happening in this time, including the new moons and the full moons and different planets stationing retrograde, are very, very, very important, that's because they all are. And that is because there is a big turn of the year coming into the year of 2025, which this year is especially significant given all the change of astrological cycles that is coming in the next year. And what is really fascinating about this Mercury retrograde and Sagittarius beginning right now is how it is configured with many of the most important cycles that will be coming in. Now, this week, we are coming to the end of a lunar cycle. And so that's one thing to get a feel for right at the top, that this Mercury retrograde period is beginning with a waning moon that, as it begins intensifying, takes us through a new moon in Sagittarius, which is going to be a very important lunar cycle we'll talk a little bit more about. And then that new moon in Sagittarius will wax into a full moon in Gemini that takes us through the heart and the most intensity of the Mercury retrograde period. And Mercury will end up stationing direct at the same time as that full moon in Gemini in the middle of December. In between those lunations, Mars will station retrograde, which is a huge deal and one of the biggest storylines going on at the end of 2024. And that will be playing out all through the first half of 2025. Additionally, the Jupiter and Saturn cycle is very active with this Mercury retrograde period. And in fact, the Mercury retrograde movement is configured exactly to Jupiter and Saturn. That's a big deal because Jupiter and Saturn are sort of the ultimate superior planets in terms of defining eras and changes in society and leadership and trends and all sorts of things that we can take into mundane astrology. The Jupiter and Saturn cycle that began at the end of 2020 took us into this new era of air configurations of Jupiter and Saturn fully. And we are now at that waxing square phase of their cycle. And that waxing phase of the Jupiter and Saturn cycle, which connects with this larger patterns of collective change and how you personally fit within to it, is the part that the Mercury retrograde phase this time around is so configured to. And so will be giving us really vital information about what is going on in our life and our personal lives and how that is intersecting with the larger changes going on in the world. This Mercury retrograde period in particular will be very important for looking at what needs to change in your life. What kind of vision, what kind of hope, what kind of dreams do you have for what you want to be creating with your life in these next couple of years? But even in the way that, as much as we can connect with even larger periods of change, and even thinking about on a bigger scale, what do you want to do with your life the rest of this whole entire decade of the 2020s? That's obviously a really big thought, but this is in Sagittarius. So having these big thoughts and these big visions and being willing to look at what are the underlying ideals, what's part of this inner core purpose, and what are the parts of that that really make you most excited, most passionate, and how does that intersect with the reality and sort of the grounded things that you can be doing right now? There will be so much changing in the world that the exciting part is that in our personal lives, there is a lot of growth opportunity coming. And while world events will be volatile and a lot will depend on how you personally are connected to whatever is going on in the world, there still is great opportunity for making change and taking your life in a more fulfilling direction. And so that's one of the kind of heart of this Mercury retrograde period, that I think we can really focus on. And because it is a Mercury retrograde, the other key point is the liminality that is always present during Mercury retrograde periods. If you've been reading my writing or listening to me talk much, you know that I talk a lot about liminality in these liminal periods of astrology. It's one of the reasons I really love astrology because it can connect us into certain times when we can make changes in our life. We can let go of our attachments and the way we've thought things have been. We can let go of patterns that we've been kind of caught up in that are not working well for us anymore. And there are periods of time where we can change some habits, change some patterns. It loosens up the possibility. It's time periods that in this liminal feeling that they have and reality that they create in our lives, we enter, with one certain awareness or presence, and we go through this deep process of interchange. And on the other side of that transit or cycle or whatever it is we're talking about, we have very radically changed something about who we are, or perhaps taken in a really powerful new source of inspiration, which can be part of our life unfolding after that time period. This is especially the case with the Mercury retrograde cycle because it's so much about our perceptions. It's so much about our communication, which can be applied to our work. It can be applied to our relationships. It can be applied to our thought and our presence and the ideas we have that sort of guide our lives. And all of these things can come up in this liminality of the Mercury retrograde periods to work on, to focus on, to meditate on, to contemplate, to let go of the things that we need to let go of and begin aligning ourselves with what is more fully coming in as guiding principles and values and ideals and so forth to really guide our work going forward. So this Mercury retrograde period is beginning on either November 25th or November 26th, depending on what time zone you're in. It begins around 22, 23 degrees of Sagittarius. It'll then begin moving backwards through the zodiac and eventually station direct on December 15th at about 6.5 degrees of Sagittarius. This means that there is a zone in your chart between 6 degrees of Sagittarius and 23 degrees of Sagittarius that Mercury is making this cycle of moving back and forth over this degree range. Mercury first entered this degree range back on November 7th, shortly after that Scorpio new moon, and it will not leave this degree zone until the beginning of 2025 on January 2nd. This means that this particular degree zone in your chart and however that's configured in your chart with other planets or houses is going through some sort of deep renewal, renovation, restoration, resurrection, regeneration, however you want to think about it. Something is deep going on here in a deep process. You will hear sometimes people talk about, don't do any work, don't sign any contracts in Mercury retrograde periods. And that is good advice in terms of bringing a lot more mindfulness to what you're choosing to get involved in during Mercury retrograde periods. But the actual reality is that's not actually always good advice because really important opportunities will come in during a Mercury retrograde period that become really important parts of your life. What often happens when something like that does happen, though, is that you sort of have some kind of work that often will experience later changes and adjustments during forthcoming Mercury retrograde periods. But it's not necessarily, it's good advice just to automatically be like, oh, I shouldn't be starting something during this time because Mercury is retrograde. What's actually going on is Mercury is just way more intensified. And so paying attention to Mercury, bringing more mindfulness to our life, looking for signs and omens and synchronicities, paying attention to our dreams, really opening up this other dimension of Mercury that you may or may not usually be attuned to, because some people are a little bit more attuned to that more material, detailed, linear type of focus that Mercury can bring. But Mercury has this whole other non-linear side and dimension that really gets opened up during the retrograde period. And so it becomes very important to pay attention to what is going on with that type of inner process and inner life for you. And what is the issues coming up that you're realizing, I really need to make a change here. I really need to burn this part of my life off and regenerate this as a new pattern or a new focus for me. It's always the case that this burning off, this kind of purging quality comes in very strong during the initial phase of Mercury retrograde. Partially that is because Mercury is stationing retrograde and then coming back towards the sun, and Mercury picks up more and more of that fiery solar influence. But this time around, it is especially true because Mercury is going retrograde in a fire sign. So, one thing to be paying attention to at the outset here is, where is my fire? What's getting in the way of burning more and radiating more and expressing more of that creative vitality I have? Where am I being led away from that, either through distraction? Could also be certain health habits or routines that are sort of deadening your vitality. All these types of things. Maybe it's being too caught up in what's going on with social media or the internet or whatever it may be. Taking time to do inner contemplation, meditation, prayer, whatever type of internal processing is available for you to go deep within yourself and open up to more of an uncertainty and an unknowing. What's really powerful about these Mercury retrograde periods is we can get really stuck in these certain patterns where we think we know what's going on and we think we know what's going to happen. And they can be very powerful for letting loose of that grip on wanting to control things and just know what everything is going to go on. And by opening up your perception, stepping more into that flexibility of consciousness, new information, important new insights will come in during these Mercury retrograde periods. This flexibility of consciousness is one of the very important themes of this particular Mercury retrograde because there is so much action happening in the mutable signs. So just to start by giving you a little bit of extra information about this cycle, most of you probably know this, but just in case you don't, the important thing about the Mercury retrograde phase is that when Mercury comes into station retrograde, Mercury has come as close to us in orbit as it ever gets in its entire orbit. So that phenomenon of Mercury appearing to move backwards by zodiacal degree is about the process of Mercury moving in between our Earth and the sun. And when we get to that heart of the Mercury retrograde, which we'll talk about, which is called the inferior conjunction, and it will happen around 14 to 15 degrees of Sagittarius. At that point, Mercury is aligned between us and the sun, as close as Mercury ever gets in its orbit to us. And it creates this very powerful moment of inner contemplation, reanimation, renewal, and regeneration. Important new ideas can be seeded and new insights can be formed that become very powerful in the season coming. This is, of course, especially powerful this time around because we are coming into the dark time of the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere, the end of 2024, the beginning of 2025, and all this very dynamic astrology that's going to be coming in. So the first big part of Mercury's retrograde phase and cycle is when Mercury reaches maximum elongation. This happened around November 16th, at around the time of that full moon in Taurus. It was conjoining Uranus recently. This is when Mercury kind of reaches its greatest height, but it also starts slowing down, and then Mercury starts getting lower and lower on the horizon, slowing and slowing until we get to a period like right now where Mercury is not really moving by zodiacal degree and it's stationing, and then it shifts into retrograde movement. These phases when Mercury hits its stationing, as well as a time when Mercury goes from being visible into being invisible, are known as conditions of intensification of Hermes. We can think about Hermes, Mercury or any other deity in your tradition or lineage that you associate with the planet Mercury coming even more alive and intensified in the world. Mercury delivers messages at these times. You will be hearing messages in your personal life, in your dreams, messages coming in current events, announcements occurring. And so this time around, sometimes when Mercury stations, it's the same time period where Mercury also moves from being visible into being invisible. This time around, Mercury is stationing where Mercury still might be, is probably still a little bit visible. And as we approach the upcoming new moon, is a time period where Mercury will be going from visible to invisible. So this week leading up to the Sagittarius new moon is very powerful for taking in whatever this new message is coming with Mercury. And then we're simultaneously entering this liminal period, especially this period as Mercury is within 15 degrees of the sun on either side, where we could think about sort of going into a chrysalis type of cocoon, some sort of inner process of change unfolding related to Mercury, and that something new is born on the other side as Mercury becomes visible again and then stations direct. This will happen at December 15th, which will be the upcoming full moon in Gemini, the sign of Mercury. So there is very much this powerful illumination of whatever this Mercury retrograde process will bring into your life. Then Mercury will start slowly moving forward again, and Mercury will then be visible in the morning. So at the start of a cycle, Mercury is visible at night after the sun sets. Mercury then goes through this liminal invisibility phase and then reemerges before sunrise in the morning in its morning star phase. After it stations direct, it will start picking up speed, and then it will reach its maximum elongation as a morning star around December 25th, around that time of the solstice. This will be the period where Mercury begins speeding up. And oftentimes it is this phase where you can more fully integrate and bring into more of your presence whatever these deeper inner changes or processes were happening during the Mercury retrograde period. This will be an especially powerful one because there's a lot of important astrology happening around this time, around the winter solstice this year, that we'll talk a little bit more about. And obviously, it's always this time of darkness in the northern hemisphere where it's always a time of connecting in with what's coming to the end of this year and this whole new cycle beginning and really deepening into that. So it's especially powerful with Mercury retrograde there this year. And if you are in the southern hemisphere, this is obviously the time you're coming into your summer solstice. So it is also extremely powerful for you, just in a different way that it's not that time of extreme darkness like it is for us here in the northern hemisphere. One of the things about this upcoming time around the Capricorn solstice is that on December 26th, after Mercury has gone direct, around the same time Mercury is reaching maximum elongation and starting to move fast again. So this is the time period, after we've already gone through the whole Mercury retrograde phase, Mercury will come back to form an opposition with Jupiter retrograde in Gemini and a square aspect with Saturn in Pisces, essentially at the same time that Saturn in Pisces and Jupiter retrograde in Gemini have just formed their next waxing square aspect. So there's this very powerful T square formed here. And so I'm bringing this up now because this is where this whole Mercury retrograde process is leading us. And in between now and then, we are going to go through Mercury, moving retrograde back to oppose Jupiter, Mercury moving retrograde back to square Saturn, station direct, and then come forward again to do it here. And so this is why we have all three of these planets coming together right here At the same time, we have Mars retrograde coming in much closer to this opposition with Pluto and Aquarius. It's just a very powerful time. And it shows where this whole Mercury retrograde is leading to and why it's going to be so important to tune into whatever insights are revealed to you during this Mercury retrograde process. So, one of the things about this aspect formed between Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius and Jupiter in Gemini is that they are in mutual reception. Mercury is going retrograde in the sign of Jupiter, and Jupiter is already retrograde in the sign of Mercury. Traditionally, these have come to be known as places of detriment. That term detriment is used because of the planet not being in its domicile and being as far away as possible from that domicile in the opposite sign. So in this case, Jupiter is not in Sagittarius, it's in the opposite sign of Gemini. Mercury is not in Gemini, it's in the opposite side of Sagittarius. This term detriment sounds really terrible, but there's actually way more nuance in how that shows up in natal charts. And even within mundane astrology, there is a lot of nuance. And so there are challenges associated with each planet being in the opposite sign. But the fact that they simultaneously do have mutual reception means there is this very powerful interchange going on. There is a degree of mitigation. And one of the things this definitely makes me think about is reaching out in terms of support or collaboration or help with community or people you're working on projects with or just within your intimate relationships. There'll be very important patterns coming up. And there very well could be some challenges with the fact that both planets are in their opposite signs, but the fact that they are also in mutual reception means that there's something we can still get out of this process. One thing about them being in the opposite sign means, we're not really getting this direct experience of Mercury, which we would get if Mercury was in Gemini. And same thing with Jupiter. We're not just getting a straight, direct expression of Jupiter, which would happen if Jupiter was in Sagittarius. They're much more these like wild card placements. And one of the things about Gemini and Sagittarius, there can be potential inflation of ideas, getting too ungrounded. As we already see with current events and everything going on, lots of sources of distraction around us, potential conflict going on and arguments that are spilling out onto social media and other places in your life. And so one thing I would definitely encourage you to do is to pick your battles and as much as possible refrain from getting into big arguments, refrain from getting overly distracted and afraid of things that are really out of your control that you can't do anything about, and do as much as you can to focus in on the work and the priorities that really truly matter to you. These are things that can still be developed and worked on with Mercury opposing Jupiter. It's actually extremely powerful for deep inner visioning because of Jupiter, as we'll talk a little bit more about, also reaching the heart of his retrograde cycle. So Jupiter will be as bright as Jupiter ever gets in the night sky during this retrograde. So it's a very interesting contrast of, Mercury going invisible into this sort of underworld psychopomp role and Jupiter being this bright star in the night sky. And so the combination of those are actually very good in terms of inner visioning, letting go of old elements of our vision and taking in a powerful new vision that will carry you forward. And so one thing about this opposition between Mercury and Jupiter is to pay attention to the dates of the exact alignments. It's not like everything's just contained within these dates and on these certain days, but they do serve as sort of like guideposts to give you a general time frame of where this Mercury, Jupiter, mutual reception, opposition could be showing up in storylines. So they first came into opposition on November 18th, shortly after the full moon in Taurus. After the new moon in Sagittarius, they will come into their second opposition on December 4th. So developments that were kind of coming up and developing through the November 18th period might show up as having very significant turning points, plot twists, things that need adjustment and change. New revisions of whatever those ideas might be will likely be emerging with the Sagittarius new moon, and especially around that December 4th date. Then, after Mercury has gone direct, Mercury will come back and form the last opposition with Jupiter on December 26th, like I already mentioned. And so, among other reasons, there's a lot of stuff going on in the astrology around the end of this year. And this is one of the really key aspects with that. But the thing is that it's not just Mercury opposing Jupiter. So we also have Mercury in Sagittarius forming a square aspect with Saturn in Pisces. And this one is the more tricky of the two. There's a lot of tricks involved in the Mercury Jupiter opposition, but they do have mutual reception. This combination really doesn't have too much going on. There's a little bit of essential dignity that Mercury has with Saturn in parts of this phase, but it's not a whole lot. And so this is a square aspect, which can, in many ways be difficult, bring up adversity. And here we are really looking at the way this Jupiterian vision, this inner visioning that we can be working on and processing during this time, how is it showing up in actual reality? Saturn can tune us more into the limits of our situation, the necessity of what we need to focus on. How much time and space do you actually have available? But of course, it's Saturn in Pisces. It's not Saturn in its own sign. And Saturn is now moving direct in Pisces, heading towards Neptune in Pisces. That will become a very important story in this next year. Mercury in its retrograde phase doesn't form a square aspect with Neptune, but it does station in range of a square aspect being there. I mean, at least have an influence from Neptune. But this is much more about tuning into the Saturn and Pisces process. But because Saturn and Pisces has this much larger Neptune story going on, which is all about reality, the way reality is changing, the way you might be going through a lot of disillusionment with the world, there is the potential for Saturn and Pisces to really pull us into this downward spiral of depression and disillusion. But there's also something about Saturn and Pisces with Neptune that means we, in some ways, need to dive into that dissolution, into this sort of solutio alchemical phase of letting go of the way things have been and embracing this inner visioning and deep contemplation. And if you're looking at things more in that way, not trying to insist on things being a certain way, letting yourself be more flexible, letting yourself tune into the way huge transitions are likely going to be showing up in your life. And if you're not going through a really intense personal transition, you know that's happening in the world, and what's going on in the world is impacting you in one way or another. And so this is why this becomes a very, very powerful Mercury retrograde cycle, because Mercury is also connecting us into Saturn. Now, what I do feel is really nice about this is that by the end of this whole process, as we come, back to December 26th again, after Mercury is direct and moving forward again, I think you can have a lot more coherence about the intersection between your vision and what you really have time and space and can really prioritize in your life. And it also accentuates the possibility of really bringing something into form through this Mercury retrograde process. Sometimes Mercury retrograde process can take us into a very deep dive of research. Saturn loves penetrating deeply, deeply into subject matters, and so does Mercury. That's one way that they have a lot of synergy together. And so this is going to be a very powerful Mercury retrograde for deep research. And if you're engaged in that, there could be something very powerful emerging for you on the other side of Mercury stationing and then coming back to make this contact with Saturn again. If you would like to look back to notice the dates of where this Mercury retrograde with Saturn story could be taking shape with just events happening in your life, you'll want to think back again to November 12th. So in this case, Mercury first made contact with Saturn in the time leading up to that Taurus full moon. The second contact will be December 6th. And then the third contact, as I've already mentioned, will be December 26th. Now, the thing that is so important about these Mercury contacts with Jupiter and Saturn is that this is taking us into the greater meaning of the Jupiter and Saturn cycle. As I've mentioned, the Jupiter and Saturn cycle goes on for 20 years. And the periods of sort of greatest impact where we can notice big patterns relating to the cycle changing are when they form a conjunction, when they form a square, and when they form an opposition. And so we had the conjunction in Aquarius in 2020. We'll have the opposition coming in at the end of this decade. So right now we're in the middle of the decade and we're getting the square aspect. If you want to think back to previous Jupiter and Saturn cycles when this happened, there was a Jupiter and Saturn conjunction in 2000. And so whatever new patterns and storylines were emerging for you with that Jupiter and Saturn conjunction in 2000 reached the same square aspect we're talking about in 2006. And similarly, if you go back to the cycle before that, there was a Jupiter and Saturn cycle at the beginning of the 1980s. It reached its square aspect in 1986. And so we always have this pattern. And that is one of the reasons why this Mercury retrograde is so important and valuable, because whatever is going on for you related to Jupiter and Saturn, you can get a lot of information from this Mercury retrograde. So there will ultimately be 3 squares formed by Jupiter and Saturn, but 2 of those 3 squares happen with Jupiter and Gemini and Saturn and Pisces. We already had the first one on August 19th. So you're already aware of something related to this. And you want to especially be thinking about, what was starting to come into your life in July and through August and so forth. But now that we're coming into the second one, there's likely some kind of important turning point. And again, what is so important is that right after they form that second exact square aspect on December 24th, Mercury comes through to form aspects with both of them on December 26th. And that's why we can see this Mercury retrograde has a really important story to reveal to us about this greater Jupiter and Saturn cycle. So that's a lot of information about the big astrological cycles that this Mercury retrograde is configured to. The important thing right now is not to get too carried away, with all these long-term potentialities of what could be happening in the world. And again, just focus in on what needs to change about your personal life. How are you interacting with your relationships? What needs to be changing in your relationships with other people? What's going on with your work, the focus of your mind? Really engaging in processes of purification, letting go of things that you want to change in your life, and so forth. The Mercury retrograde coming in becomes very powerful to make those changes that will then become important aspects of these much larger changes that will be coming in this next year. So as we look at what's going on this week, the week of November 25th and 26th, keep in mind that Hermes is coming alive in the world. This could be bringing all sorts of deep information for you. And it's most important to be paying attention to the signs, omens, messages from dreams, and be curious about those signs and omens. Hold the tension of the complexity of them. Don't think they just automatically mean one thing or another. Use them as navigational devices to take you into an even deeper process. There's all sorts of information that Mercury can reveal during its retrograde phase. But keep in mind, it's not typically the type of really linear, clear-cut kind of information. It is a little bit non-linear. It's a little bit warped. It's very cyclical. We do have Neptune and Pisces involved also in a very loose way. And with all the change going on in the world, with all the confusing messages in the news and current events to sift through and sort through. And so, one way of working with this is to go deep inside through a process of regeneration and renewal, a deep inner process. This is a chart for the moment that Mercury stations retrograde between 22 and 23 degrees of Sagittarius. And you can see that it is a waning moon with the moon in Libra, moving away from a sextile aspect with the sun in Sagittarius. That moon in Libra is also near the south node of the moon. So there is some sort of deep waning interiority process of letting go, old memories perhaps resurfacing that need to be processed, but also maybe need to be laid to rest. That quality is very, very accentuated here with Mercury stationing retrograde. But there's also another factor that I think is very interesting to bring up, and that is the specific degree where Mercury is stationing retrograde. Mercury is stationing retrograde at the degree of Ras Alhague, who is the alpha star of Ophiuchus, the serpent handler. It's basically the star that is in the position of being like the head of the figure holding this great serpent. And if you project that star down to the ecliptic, it comes out to be pretty much the same place where Mercury is stationing retrograde. You may know about Ophiuchus because his foot is sort of stepping down on the ecliptic on the zodiac belt, and Ophiuchus always gets brought up sometimes by scientists and astronomers, saying why astrologers don't understand the zodiac, even though we're all aware that this is where Ophiuchus is. But one of the figures in mythology that is connected to Ras Alhague and Ophiuchus that's very interesting to keep in mind with this Mercury retrograde is Asclepius, the divine healer. Asclepius was the son of Apollo, who was given the healing arts from Apollo, as well as his mentor, Chiron. And he, in fact, becomes such a powerful healer that he is known to have actually been able to resurrect the dead. And because of this, he is Zeus punishes him, but at the same time also lifts him up into the sky as a constellation and becomes the Ophiuchus constellation. He is one of the living images of this constellation. And so when there's activation of it, and activation of Ras Alhague, the deity Asclepius becomes a figure that we can work with. Asclepius is fascinating, especially in terms of going through liminal thresholds of change, healing, bringing up toxic, poisonous material from our past, poisonous material circulating in the collective right now, and transmuting that, finding ways to work with and let go of some of this wounding material. But at the same time, our own wounds could very likely be surfacing, wounds from the past. And whatever does come up, Ras Alhague being present with the Mercury stationing shows there's something very powerful to ultimately get out of this retrograde regarding potentially deep inner wounds you have from the past, as well as wounding issues that are just going on in the collective. The sanctuaries of Asclepius were places where people went for healing, and they often would go when they were even looking for a miraculous cure. They had something wrong with them that they were told there was nothing they could do about them. And it has been documented that people would have these miraculous cures. And one of the ways that Asclepius would work at these temples is there'd be a whole process of purification and sacrifice and ritual. And the people coming for healing would end up having this sort of ritualized dream incubation where Asclepius would appear and give them information about a cure, or somehow that unconscious dreaming would even be a solution in and of itself and bring some type of cure. So this really accentuates this deep inner process that we can go through during this retrograde. And I find it to be a very hopeful sign of what we can ultimately personally get out of this retrograde. So really pay attention to dreams and inner processes and what type of wounding is coming up. And as you deepen into that and take the courage to face it, really pay attention to how things start changing, how things may start shifting in your life as you come into deeper relationship with it. Perhaps you're able to let go of some issues from the past, or at least come into some different relationship with them in one way or another. There's a quote from Peter Kingsley about the relationship between Asclepius and Apollo that I really like in this way. He wrote that this healing of Apollo and Asclepius is all about this intimate relationship with death, and that to heal is to know the limits of healing and also what lies beyond, and that there's no real healing without the ability to face death itself. This great threshold and transition in the collective we're going through, it is bringing up so much uncertainty for people. And there's something about this relationship with death and having even a fearlessness about it, and being able to start cultivating a greater sense of fearlessness and an embrace of participating in the world and participating in creation and getting excited about what you can do with your life and in collaboration with other people that you love in your life. That fiery sort of sense of renewal, I think, will be available for us during this Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius. So I'm very hopeful about the figure of Asclepius being part of this for us. Now, what's additionally interesting about Asclepius being involved and how Asclepius can take us through these life, death transitions of regeneration and rebirth is that Mercury is at the same place in Mercury's cycle. So when Mercury goes retrograde and disappears from visibility, Mercury is very much going into the underworld and taking on this psychopomp role of guiding us into our own inner material. This ancient role of Mercury being able to go into the underworld and be part of releasing souls into the afterlife and the ancestral realm. Mercury's capacity to move between the upper world and the underworld with ease is part of Mercury's meaning in astrology. And we see this very accentuated during Mercury's retrograde phase. One of the things about this is when Mercury is actually visible or invisible will depend a lot upon your particular location. But an idealized degree range that we use in astrology is this 15-degree range. And so when Mercury becomes within 15 degrees of the sun, we can think about that symbolically going with the phase of Mercury moving from being visible to invisible, even if in your specific location, it might be a different date. And to get that information, you would need to look up some astronomical software or calculations related to your specific location. But this degree range of 15 degrees does work. And one of the things about this is to think about it in terms of Plato and sort of that idealized realm of forms. In that same way, we think about this idealized sort of archetypal field. This 15-degree range is very much an ideal, and it does actually work pretty well as defining this period. And so this will happen on November 28th. This will be the period around this date, very close to the upcoming new moon in Sagittarius. This is when Mercury will deepen into invisibility and deepen into the psychopomp role during this waning moon. You know, and when we think about this dark moon having association with liminal intermediary crossroad guides like Hecate, it's very potent right here to do a lot of this inner contemplation, the types of things you may already practice during a dark waning moon of inner visioning. This is all going to be really amplified and accentuated with Mercury in this particular phase at this time. And so as Mercury goes into this field of darkness and disappears from view, at the same time, there can be our inner life illuminated. And this will especially be the case as we approach that conjunction between Mercury and the Sun. There can be something very much illuminated within our inner life that can be very profound and become important sources of guidance going forward. So, keeping all of this in mind, this new moon in Sagittarius becomes very important. We can see here that the new moon is very much configured to Jupiter and Saturn. And what's really interesting is that this new moon is, forming a square with Saturn and opposing Jupiter. And then the full moon in Gemini coming later will be forming a square with Neptune. So it is a lunar cycle that's also very much connected to Saturn and Neptune starting to come to the end of their cycle. The other thing going on here, though, is we have a trine between Venus and Capricorn and Uranus and Taurus. And we have Mars slowing down to station retrograde within a week of this lunation. That stationing of Mars, which is coming in really strong here, is really going to accentuate the liminality, really intensify the inner fire and the inner forces of change that might be erupting from within you. And that is why this inner process of Mercury retrograde can be really important to come into relationship with this. But because we also have this Venus-Uranus trine happening here at the same time, we can see there is this great potential for a larger sense of vision to come in here. And so that is something to really embrace. Open up the field of possibility. And then as we go through this retrograde, you'll become a little bit more clear about what is really possible in more of a short-term way, to start configuring goals in a shorter time span to really start building towards that larger vision of what you want to see happen with all the potential that's going to be coming available. The other thing about this new moon in Sagittarius is that it happens right before the opposition between Mercury and Jupiter. And again, this is also happening with Mars stationing retrograde. And so in this way, this becomes a very powerful new moon to open up greater vision. Now, on the topic of Mars retrograde, this is a very big topic that I don't have time to fully go into in this particular video. But Mars retrograde periods always bring huge waves of change. And this one particularly is powerful because of the opposition forming between Mars retrograde in Leo and Pluto in Aquarius. It is going to be extremely powerful in terms of inner change, inner desires, this intensified heat of Mars melting down these old secure forms in our life. And as things are melting down and shifting, new possibilities are emerging. And so again, this is why this Mercury retrograde is so powerful, to start noticing what is changing. You don't have to be leaping to start making these changes right now. It's really just paying attention on inner levels to what is changing so you can start moving with how this might be playing out in your life going forward. This Mars retrograde storyline is going to be playing out for months. So whatever is happening here at the outset of Mars stationing is only one small part of the opening story. And so, for example, Mars will be stationing on December 6th at 6 degrees of Leo. And then eventually Mars will come retrograde to get as close to us as Mars ever gets in its cycle, where Mars becomes, brilliantly bright red, as bright red as it ever gets in the sky. This will be happening around the middle of January. There'll be a very powerful full moon in Cancer aligned with this. And then Mars will ultimately start slowing down and then stationing direct at 17 degrees of Cancer around February 23rd. Mars will then start moving forward again. And by the end of April, Mars will form its final opposition with Pluto. So again, this is a much larger process of change that we're only tuning into the very, very beginning of here. But Mercury retrograde will be really helpful to start figuring out how you're coming into relationship about whatever is going to be happening for you with this Mars retrograde period. Now, what is incredible is that at the same time Mars is stationing and increasing the heat and fire of this inner Mars process, Mercury will be entering the heart of the sun, which is also when Mercury has this much intensified inner process. And in Sagittarius, it is very fiery. And so this becomes an incredibly powerful moment of renewal and reanimation. Again, when Mercury is as close to us as it ever comes in its orbit, aligned in between us and the sun, and it will be happening in the middle of Sagittarius at about 14.5 degrees of Sagittarius. This inferior conjunction of Mercury will be happening on December 5th, essentially the same exact time that Mars is stationing retrograde. And you can see here that Mercury with the sun is essentially opposite Jupiter and forming a square with Saturn. So it's simultaneously connecting us to that Jupiter-Saturn cycle, and it's also picking up important information about that stationing of Mars. And the moon is involved as well. It's very beautiful here that it's very much like we're getting the moon coming in as an intermediary, not unlike Hecate or Artemis, helping us get information. Doesn't mean it's going to be comfortable, but it's going to be important information. The moon will be in Aquarius, and the moon will be moving away from Pluto and moving away from opposing Mars into forming a sextile with Mercury and the sun and a trine with Jupiter. It's a perfect setup to deeply attune to what is going on. And I strongly encourage you to do inner contemplation, meditation, prayer, ritual, divination, whatever can help you get involved in this deeper inner process at this time. Now, there is another stunning stellar connection with Mercury at this part of its phase. I mentioned previously that Mercury will be stationing near Ras Alhague. Mercury will be having its inferior conjunction of reanimation close to the degree of Ras Alhague. Ras Alhague is in a constellation associated with Heracles. More anciently, it's been known as the kneeler because the image looks like a figure kneeling. And we have stories that, in addition to Heracles, there's also a strong connection to Gilgamesh. You know, Heracles and Gilgamesh are these ancient heroes who are immortal and mortal. They're sort of these divine mortals who, in some ways, are extremely solar heroes. But it's important because they are solar heroes. We're not just talking about the day sun and these overcoming heroes. These are heroes that go through a night journey. They go through initiation. They are brought down into the underworld, and they go through their own process of redemptive expiation and resurrection and rebirth. And so it is a pretty incredible symbolism for Ras Alhague to be involved here at the inferior conjunction of Mercury. Bernadette Brady has done interesting work with Ras Alhague in that she connects it into this theme of acknowledging the natural order, because that kneeler resembles an Egyptian hieroglyphic sign for being in the correct position in society and giving service to the divine. This is really interesting because some of the mythology of Heracles is also very much about this in terms of as a symbol and sort of a symbol of mystery initiation in some ways. We can think about the star being connected about really going into that deep place of yourself, your inner purpose, and these inner virtues, and focusing on that and following that path. And keep in mind, this does not mean it's going to be the easy path. It might be full of adversity. It might be full of things you are terrified of, things about yourself you're afraid of to face. But what is going to be required of you is to face that night journey and face those fears if they are in the way of connecting more deeply to your purpose and whatever it is about yourself that, and the sense of destiny you have, that sort of that sense of of why are you here? Why did you choose to be here in the world right now with all of this stuff going on around us? There's a reason that you're here, and there's a purpose that you have, and it's that connection with that. It's not this inflated, hubristic, full of hubris type of claiming of destiny. It's claiming that destiny that is your essential purpose. And so it's extremely powerful that Mercury is having a solar conjunction so near this star. Now, the other thing happening at the same time that Mercury is having this reanimation, that Mars is stationing retrograde to oppose Pluto, is that Jupiter will be forming an opposition with the Sun on December 7th. And so Jupiter will be at this point of its retrograde cycle where it's as bright as it ever gets in the sky. It's as close to us as it ever gets. And when Jupiter is in this phase of being about 7.5 degrees on either side of the Sun, it's called curtailed passage because basically as the Sun is setting, Jupiter's rising, but because of that liminality of twilight, we can't see Jupiter kind of on the horizon. We're not able to see Jupiter until the Sun sets a little bit lower. And so there's this sort of amplified liminality about Jupiter. And the symbolism of that's just important to keep in mind, just goes with what I've already been saying, which is that there is this powerful inner visioning possible. It's not necessarily the type of inner visioning that's going to show up like right now. It's more like inner visioning of the possibilities, inner visioning of what needs to change about your life, and using that as guidance going forward. And this curtailed passage basically takes us from the end of November until the middle of December, right when Mercury stations direct. So interestingly, Mercury will come out of the retrograde and start going forward again. At the same time, Jupiter is coming out of this curtailed passage. So again, that really shows how there's something that can start emerging into more form and reality on the other side of this Mercury retrograde passage. Now, in terms of the rest of the Mercury retrograde, one of the days that just stands out to me, just to bring your attention to right now, is on December 12th, because Venus in Aquarius will form an opposition with Mars retrograde in Leo. This brings the Venus-Mars cycle also into this whole configuration. The Mars-Venus cycle is so important in our personal lives, and they formed a conjunction earlier this year on February 24th at about 7 degrees of Aquarius, essentially right in this same location. So you might want to think back to that period of time in February. Could be things changing with your relationships. There's a real connection also here with just the inner values and inner sense of desire we have and what we really want to go out and go after in our life and pursue with our desire in the world that the Mars-Venus cycle really taps us into. So there will be really important information coming in here at the same time that Mercury, being retrograde in Sagittarius, is starting to come to the end of its cycle. And you can see that Mercury is forming a sextile with Venus. And although Mercury does not complete the trine with Mars, there is something of the Mars that Mercury is also picking up through that trine. So we can, again, really deepen into whatever about this Venus-Mars cycle is coming up for us at this time. And then the next day, on December 13th, Mercury will be reaching that 15-degree distance from the Sun and returning to visibility. This is a very powerful moment for Mercury in its cycle because although it hasn't quite stationed direct yet, the fact that it's crossing that 15-degree zone means that Mercury is emerging from this underworld night journey of invisibility, and it's returning to share its light with us. And this is amplifying the potency of Mercury stationing direct. That's going to be, again, extremely powerful because when Mercury does station direct, we have a Gemini full moon happening at the same time, with the moon in Gemini separating from Jupiter and applying to Neptune. This is so powerful because whatever we are coming into deeper touch with and contact with and realization about at the end of this Mercury retrograde process is being fully illuminated by this lunation. And so we will get extremely important insights about whatever process has been going on for us at this time. So, again, extremely important to be paying attention to what is showing up here at this Gemini full moon. And then after Mercury stations direct, reaches its maximum elongation around December 26th and starts speeding up, we will come to the end of 2024 and the beginning of 2025. And that is when Mercury will come back across that degree of Ras Alhague and move forward beyond that 22-degree zone of Sagittarius with 6 degrees of Sagittarius in your chart. So there's an incredible role Mercury is playing in shepherding us across this transition of 2024 and 2025. It will make this actually a powerful year to actually be setting some New Year's resolutions and getting a sense of what you really want to change in your life. Whatever that is, if you're somebody that likes to make New Year resolutions, this Mercury retrograde is going to give you all the information you need to know about whatever that is going to be. If you'd like to talk to me about your chart and have a consultation with me, I love doing natal consultations with people. On my site, graycrawford.net, you can get information about how to schedule a consultation with me. I also have a Patreon in which I have monthly meetings and different levels and additional information that I share there. That if you'd like to get involved with that and find out more information about it, you can also find a link to my Patreon on my website. And if you haven't yet subscribed to my YouTube channel, please do, because I'll be having more videos to share in the future. Thank you for watching and best of luck with this very powerful Mercury retrograde beginning now.